Investigation carried out in relation to the events on the day by Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary, and then a follow-up investigation or report in relation to more wider thematic review of public order policing in the UK. As a result of that, there were recommendations including that keeping the peace should be updated. The lawyer to HMIC at the time was a person called Jane Gordon. I talked to you earlier on around how the Policing Board in Northern Ireland had appointed two human rights barristers to oversee issues there. One I explained was Keir Starmer, went on to be DPP. The other one was Jane Gordon. So basically she was involved in writing a lot of reports in relation to Northern Ireland. She then moved to HMIC. You can actually trace where she has used some case studies in relation to her time in Northern Ireland to inform those HMIC reports. And therefore she was also then involved in the process, I suppose, as a legal advisor in relation to the update of keeping the peace. The approach that Sue Sim took was basically she appointed an officer, I think of the rank of Chief Inspector, Paul Orchard, if my memory serves me correctly, and he coordinated the process, and a number of people helped him to do that. I was one of them. I led the Northern Ireland sort of input to that, which was quite significant because of the reasons I've said vis-a-vis Jane Gordon. Interestingly, if you look at Keeping the Peace in 2010, I refer to a lengthy list of references at the back of it, and it is quite lengthy. I was just casting my eye over this last night. So it's lots of other ACPO documents. There's only one document where there's a specific reference to any particular police service, and it's about an aid memoir produced by PSNI. So PSNI, therefore, our input to that was quite significant. I led that input. I then also acted on an ongoing liaison with Paul Orchard and others in relation to effectively carrying out a sort of editorial type function in relation to Keeping the Peace document. So I have a substantial involvement in the development of it.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. White. If we can now turn to your evidence on Marikana. And if I can start by asking you the scope of your evidence, particularly what events you were concentrating on and in terms of with respect to which you express your opinions.
Indeed, Chair. While I've given evidence previously about receiving this hard drive and therefore looking at the policy framework in relation to those documents, but in terms of actual evidence of events, my focus was directed purely and simply to the events of in and around the 9th of August through to the events on the 16th. They didn't look wider at that in terms of the role of South African Police Service outside of Marikana, or extended either sort of before or after that date.
Mr. White, if we then turn to the events of the 13th of August 2012, which is the first, those are the events in your time frame. So you deal with the 9th to the 16th, but the 13th is the first set of events that you express conclusions on. Chair, for the record, these commence at page 50 of Mr. White's final statement, part 5. Mr. White, I'd like us to canvass, in summary, your overall conclusions about the 13th. So if you could take us through the different themes that you cover and the conclusions you draw in relation to the 13th.
Chair, if it's helpful, before I specifically refer to the 13th, to a large extent, both in relation to the 13th and the 16th, which I'm sure Ms. Leroux will be asking me about shortly, I would say I largely talk about a number of key themes, which are around the intelligence available and how it was used, the planning process, the briefing of officers, the command and control of the actual incidents, and then issues in relation to accountability. When we come to talk to around the 16th, there are issues that I raise specifically in relation to tactics, not so much on the 13th, but those are the key themes. With that in mind, then, looking at the incident in relation to the 13th, I suppose it's fair to say nothing happens in a vacuum, and therefore, although we're concentrating on the 13th, you look at it in the context of obviously what's been happening in Marikana over the previous number of days. So the first thing that struck me was that when I was looking for plans in relation to informing the South African Police's operation around this within the hard drive. And forgive me, I don't have the reference immediately to hand. I don't know if you need this at this stage. But there is a plan for the South African Police Service in relation to, I think it's Friday the 10th, therefore, if my memory serves me correctly. However, the plan for the Saturday and the Sunday is basically the same plan. I mean, it's effectively, it was listed under different exhibits, if you like, but it was simply a photocopy of the same plan. Therefore, that seemed to me that both in relation to planning and intelligence, there was no ongoing update. And it struck me as odd, given the very serious incidents that were happening across that weekend. Now, I know that the South African Police, certainly my evidence is not that they didn't respond to this in any way, because I know from other evidence that there was an increase in resources and whatever. But certainly, one, in relation to planning, and two, in relation to the intelligence, there doesn't seem to be an ongoing interplay with the intelligence and updating the risk assessment, for example, with regards to potentially attacks on police officers and how you might mitigate that. Also, I was struck by, and this is an issue which goes across the whole of my evidence, is the very limited nature of the intelligence. I was presented with a document which is TT5, is the exhibit, which, as I understand, is a composite of all of the intelligence which was available for the entire operation. I checked with my legal team on a number of occasions to make sure that I was reading this and I was interpreting, back to the issue around canalise, Mr. Chairman, that when I was reading this as a composite of all of the intelligence, that's exactly what it meant, because there were 10 entries on that document. I think the first 3 of them refer to February and the 4th one refers to May. One of the entries refers to the fact that a JOC has been set up, and a number of entries seem to refer to the views of senior police officers. There are 2 or possibly 3 entries in that document which covers the whole period, including up to the tragic events of the 16th, that would be what I would consider to be actionable intelligence. So it seemed to me that there are clear issues in relation to intelligence. Even if you look at that document, there is one of the bits of information that I would consider to be actionable intelligence. And there's evidence then that I think Brigadier Engelbrecht, and I have to apologise at this stage, my legal team, I've been having some difficulty with the pronunciation of names.
Got that one right.
Thank you. There's a statement from Brigadier Engelbrecht where he talks about receiving this intelligence from a handler, and he then communicates that, I think, by both text and possibly also verbally to General Mpembe. My interpretation of that is he thinks that this is so significant that the overall commander needs to know, and I congratulate him for doing so. There is a subsequent reference in his statement then to a conversation between him and General Mpembe, where he's obviously expressing some concern with regards to how that intelligence was actioned. And Mr. Mpembe, in fairness to him, I think says, it wasn't actioned as I would have intended. The conclusion to be drawn there is that obviously when that intelligence was originally given, I think Mr. Engelbrecht's expectation was, and it was around a threat to damage the property, and that it would probably have been policed out, is a term that I would be familiar with. In other words, maybe deploy a lot of high-profile police officers, and I think this would be consistent with what Lieutenant Colonel Scott subsequently goes on to talk about as his visible policing plan. In other words, lots of police officers in the area try and maintain stability and also in a preventative role. So, turning back to TT5, one, I was very shocked at how little intelligence seemed to be available. Two, even within the 10 entries, very few were actually what I would consider to be actionable intelligence. And then if you turn to one of the issues that was actionable intelligence, it didn't seem to have been properly actioned, not in my interpretation, but I think in the interpretation of Brigadier Engelbrecht. The last thing I would say in relation to intelligence then is that at Exhibit LLL 11, which is, I think, the document which is the sort of internal review carried out by SABC after all of these events, they highlight this issue around the fact that intelligence was lacking, and I know that a number of other police officers have given oral evidence to that effect as well. So in relation to intelligence, I don't think that One, there was very much available or certainly being brought to the attention of the people who needed to know, and second, it wasn't being actioned properly. Would you like me to move on, or do I need to answer?
Mr. White, with respect to the operation on the 13th that Major General Mpembe led, do you have any comment with relation to intelligence and how it related to that operation specifically?
Well, specifically, I think that the issue is that General Mpembe is asked to go and engage with this crowd who are at the railway line, who are armed. And the information is, that, as I understand it, that's coming from what's viewed on the CCTV. And then General Mabumbo issues this instruction. So I would have expected, ordinarily that there might have been some intelligence around, who that group are, what maybe potentially their intentions are, their makeup of it, given the fact that it is likely that potentially this group have been the people who have been involved in the ongoing disorder that has taken place over the last couple of days. But I don't see any specific references to that, which would inform a risk assessment, which would be around how likely these people would be to be violent towards the police.
Mr. White, turning then to planning for that operation on the 13th of August, in your statement you make several criticisms of the police relating to planning. Could you take the Commission through those?
Yeah, I think that a lot of the issues that I deal with in relation to planning in relation to this particular operation are at 5.2.11 of my initial statement, or sorry, my final statement. And suffice to say that in some of the interaction that has gone between
Page 55.
I think that's correct, Mr. Chairman. In some of the interactions that has gone between my legal team and the South African Police legal team, it's about. I think I've been asked the question to accept that this was a spontaneous incident that SAPS were responding to. In my provisional statement, I was actually pointing out that this was a spontaneous incident that I think that they were responding to spontaneously. I made some comments to the fact that General Mpembe's statement, the first statement of General Mpembe that I read, could have been read. In fact, how I read it was sort of suggesting that a plan had been in place and a command structure had been in place. The command structure that we ultimately see heading then after the 13th towards the 16th. But it certainly in his original statement it suggests that that's in place before the operation that takes place on the 13th. So it was I that was identifying that it was spontaneous in the first instance, and it absolutely was spontaneous. So the issue then becomes around planning, and I know that some of the criticisms have been raised in relation to what I've said, that the police service have got this situation to deal with where you've got a group of in and around 200 to 300, whatever the number is. It doesn't really matter if it's 200 to 300. It's a very large group of people armed with traditional weapons, and therefore they need to go and do something about it. Absolutely, totally agree. And the criticism I think that's been thrown back at me is that, did Mr. White expect us to sit for a number of hours until we worked through a planning process and we wrote up a plan and perhaps had it photocopied and bound and whatever? Nowhere in my statement did I say this. I basically say they're going to deal with this incident, and I think either they're going to deal with it on the basis that here are 200 to 300 people who are armed, and we are going to disarm them in accordance with General Mabumbo's direction. I think if you're sending, and I think Mr. Mpembe took with him around 70, 80, and it's been recently suggested to me 100. Again, I don't know that it's a lot of police officers who are obviously armed police officers. So my point is that if they're going to disarm these people, well then, I think that needs a degree of planning as to how they're going to do it. You're basically sending a large number of heavily armed police officers to engage with a large number of heavily armed protesters. I don't know the traditions of South Africa and whatever, but in all that I've read, it would seem if these are traditional weapons, maybe they were intended to be used, maybe not. There's evidence that obviously these weapons have been used over the previous weekend around killing people. But I suspect, from all that I've read, that people wouldn't voluntarily just lay those down and simply walk away. That seems to be a logical conclusion. Therefore, I'm looking at this on the basis that if you are going to send a large group of heavily armed cops to deal with a large group of heavily armed people in order to disarm them, I think that requires a degree of planning. How you're going to do that, and what you expect everyone to do. If, on the other hand, you're going and saying, look, in the context of this situation, the lesser of two evils is if we could just escort them back to the copy, as subsequently happens. So you're not going to disarm them, you're simply going to escort. Well then, I think the level of planning needs to be less. And again, I'm talking about a dynamic plan, which General Mpembe might even just hold in his head while he's getting there. But it's him understanding what it is that he wants to do, what he wants to achieve, and very, very importantly then, communicates that to the people who are with him. So actually, if you look at my statement, I talk about plan or brief. So, the criticism that seems to be sort of raised that I'm suggesting that they waited a few hours until they got a plan, I don't say that. So we have the situation where General Mpembe goes, and again, I think both in my provisional statement and also in my final statement, in fact, at 5.2.11, the paragraph starts off, in simple terms, I do not criticise the decision to attend to the group on the railway line, nor the decision to seek to persuade the group to voluntarily disarm, nor would I criticise an intention to disarm the group. So the very fact that General Mpembe goes, and I couldn't understand initially why he as the overall commander would go as opposed to sending Officer Callitz, who's the operational commander. But
the reason he gave was that Brigadier Callitz couldn't speak the vernacular language and so on, and he could. I think that was the main reason he gave.
And I was just about to say, Chair, when I first engaged with the evidence, I couldn't understand why this was so, and when I wrote my provisional statement, but subsequently that point was clarified, where it's because General Mpembe potentially speaks the language, and I think that's entirely plausible then, and of course he was probably the right person to do that as opposed to Callitz, so no issue there. So the issue is then that he goes and attends the scene. I don't know what was in General Mpembe's head at that moment in time. He talks initially to the group. He negotiates with them, and I think I congratulate him for doing so. I think that he is doing his best. And during the course of that time, he therefore then may have changed his intention from actually disarming, consistent with General Mabumbo's direction to him, to, as I said a few minutes ago, maybe he decides the lesser of the two evils here is actually just let's escort them back to the copy. Again, that's what I would consider to be dynamic planning, and I think that's entirely appropriate in the circumstances. But the issue is then, from the evidence, he says we're now going to escort them to the copy. At no stage do I see any evidence of any briefing to his officers. Now again, I'm not talking about the type of sophisticated briefing I referred to earlier on. I'm talking about that the senior officer tells the police officers who are going to carry out this function what he wants them to do. Because there's lots of evidence from police officers who give conflicting reports of what they understood they were being asked to do. So my point of criticism...
My understanding is that I don't know if you read Colonel Marafi's evidence. Colonel Marafi says, as I understand his evidence, that he didn't agree with the decision which the General had made to escort them. He thought they should have been disarmed, but he accepted that was the General's decision, and so be it. And I also understood him to say that that was communicated to the commanders, to the section commanders, to pass it on. The problem, of course, is we know what happened thereafter. The tear gas was fired and the stun grenades. And of course there is, as you know, a conflict of fact. And you very properly refrain from seeking to resolve the conflict of fact. It's something that we can't do. We have to resolve it. But on General Mpembe's evidence, he decided that they would be escorted. He communicated that to Colonel Marafi. That was communicated to the section commanders, and that escorting process commenced. He was afraid they might deviate into the informal settlement, so he sent the Inyalas along the road to protect the informal settlement, so they couldn't go to the informal settlement. There's a dispute as to whether they deviated and started going towards the informal settlement. The evidence of Vermaak and Lustu in the helicopter is that they didn't. There's no evidence that we can see from the video that they did, that they deviated to the settlement. But Mpembe does seem to think that, suggests that, says in fact there was a deviation, but he says it wasn't a cause for concern because he'd already dealt with the situation by putting the Nyalas in place to stop them getting up to any mischief in the informal settlement. He's very clear, the fact he didn't give an order to fire tear gas. As far as he was concerned, the escorting had to continue. That had been communicated to Rafi and then the second commander. He was the only person in terms of the standing order who was authorized to give any other instruction for use of force, even in the form of tear gas. He never gave such order. It wasn't necessary, he said. If he had given it, he would have given it by radio, and of course then everybody else, others would have reacted as well. That didn't happen. The only person who fired the tear gas was someone on the extreme left, who was obviously the wrong person to be given order to if the people were deviating to the right. And as far as he and Mpembe was concerned, no such order was given to Kuhn. You make the point that if Kuhn acted without a proper order, there should have been disciplinary steps. That was only very belatedly done after the point was raised when he gave evidence. But I think that's a summary of his evidence. There are, of course, as you know, conflicting versions that he did give the order. And that's, of course, as I've said, he vigorously denies. And that's an issue that we have to resolve. But on Mpembe's version, he made a decision which he said was in accordance with the doctrine of situational appropriateness. I'd like to get your views on that in a moment. Communicated that to Marafi, that was then communicated to the section commanders. As far as he was concerned, nobody who was there as part of the group of members of the police service could have been under any misapprehension as to what had to be done. And on his version, there was what amounted to insubordination, that either acting on his own or acting on the instruction from somebody else who had no right to give the instruction, tear gas was fired, which then Mpembe described as the spark which caused the trouble. Beloy then took it upon himself to fire a stun grenade. Again, there's a dispute of fact, but on Mpembe's version, Beloy had no right to do that either. And then, of course, the trouble started. So those are the facts which Mpembe has told us. And insofar as you deal in your evidence with that scenario, then the fact that you've stated to us on with respect entirely correct. But anyway, I just put that to you now because it may save a bit of time in what follows.
Chair, if it's helpful, I think you've summarised my understanding very accurately. If I could just make one point, the issues around Kuhn and follow-up disciplinary procedures, the issues around whether it was a deviation or not. I mean, as you say, there are lots of issues of fact in there which are not for me to deal with, and I don't. The reason that I offer my opinion with regards to I don't think that this was properly thought out, and I do stress that I used the word or on a number of occasions in relation to how I deal with this issue, plan or briefing. So let's, as I've said, I never expected General Mpembe to have a written plan for this. A dynamic situation that I identified in the first instance as a spontaneous response to a spontaneous incident. So the focus is very much on dynamic planning that General Mpembe thinks. And as you have articulated, Chair, and I'm more than happy to talk about the situational appropriateness, I don't have any issues around what he did. First of all, try and instruct them to disarm. If they'd all laid down their arms and walked away, would not have been a fantastic outcome? Yeah, absolutely. But they didn't. So then he changed his plan. No issue with that whatsoever. I say, or brief. Now, I'm very aware of Mr. Marafe says that initially when he was with General Mpembe at the scene, he had said, look, I'm the POPs commander, I'll take over. So there was a dispute between the two of them. However, that was resolved. General Mpembe said, I'm in charge. And in fairness, Mr. Marafi says after that there was no confusion. Again, I absolutely accept that. However, the one thing that I would offer up is that, and if you're happy enough, I'll refer to these by exhibit numbers, Chair, because I do have a difficulty with pronunciation. At 8HH30, police officer says, Mpembe told us to escort them. Then an instruction was given that they must be dispersed and disarmed and CS to be used. 8HH31, there's no mention of any briefing whatsoever. When he arrives, Mpembe speaking to the miners and telling them to surrender the weapons. The general gives an order to escort them. He then instructed us to disarm them. He instructed us to use CS. 8HH33, no mention of any briefing whatsoever. General gave an order to escort the strikers. The general then gave another instruction to block them as they were on their way to attack non-strikers. 38, HHH 38, no briefing. Mpembe instructed us to disarm the miners, open brackets, warriors, close brackets. HHH 27, Mpembe instructed the miners must be stopped and disarmed, etc., etc., etc.
The question I put to you was on the assumption that that evidence is rejected. Obviously, if the evidence is accepted, then certain things follow, and you have your views on that, which I think you've made clear. There are possible indications, I put it no higher than that, possible indications that certain members of the police who were there decided after the event to cover up for what had happened. And they made entries in their pocketbooks, which are conflict with each other, as to the nature of the order, as to what was done, and so on. But the objective fact is that only one tear gas canister was fired, which one would have expected more if a general order of the kind he's alleged to have made had been given. Again, the next concrete fact, objective fact, is that Beloya then fired a stun grenade. If Mpembe is telling the truth, obviously that's something we have to keep an open mind on till the end. If Mpembe is telling the truth, then those entries you're referring to are false. Were made as part of a conspiracy to put the blame on Mpembe and to exonerate the people responsible for the spark, and also to avoid investigations into insubordination, disciplinary steps, and all that kind of thing. Now, whether that's so or not, obviously we can't find at this stage, but the response to what you put is that one possible interpretation is those allegations were false, as I say, part of a conspiracy after the event to blame Mpembe. And of course, you read the evidence later, what happened to Roots. That was an ongoing debate. But at this point, on the assumption, which may turn out to be an erroneous one, but on the assumption that Mpembe is telling the truth on what happened then your criticism is important. As I've said, according to him, it was a dynamic situation. You don't quarrel with his attempt to persuade the miners to lay down their arms. It may have been a rather forlorn hope that he could succeed, but it was worth trying, I think you accept. Once it didn't work, he then had to make a decision, and of course communicate it to his men. The decision he took was not to try to disarm them, despite the fact that certain of his officers thought he should, but to escort them. That was not agreed with and ultimately disobeyed on his version. The question is whether you can criticize him on the basis of the facts I put to you for what he did. If he told Marafi what the decision was, if the officers knew, the section commanders were told, as I think Marafi makes it clear, is there really a problem in relation to briefing in a dynamic situation?
Chair, absolutely. If General Mpembe created a dynamic plan, as I would call it, in his mind, he understood what he wanted to achieve, how he wanted to achieve that, and he communicated that through. And it's not General Mpembe's responsibility to go and individually tell every single officer, given the nature of the circumstances when these officers would have been located at various parts around the miners, because he initially thought that potentially they were going to disarm them. Again, I would go back to the point that I made earlier on. If his initial intention had been to disarm them, I would have thought that there should have been some degree of briefing in relation to how that was going to be done, thinking about, well, what if they don't? Are we going to forcibly disarm? So in attending the scene, if it was his prior intention that he was going to disarm, how was he going to do that, and was that properly communicated so that the officers could be in a tactical configuration which gave the police the best advantage to be able to carry that plan out if that was the case? However, set that aside. We now have the situation where he negotiates with them, and it's obvious to him that in order to avoid a confrontation, which seems to be what he's saying, is that he's not going to disarm, he's basically going to escort. And accepting all that you say, if he then decides, this is what I'm going to do, this is how we're going to do it, he communicates that to effectively his number two, Marafe. And Marafe then, his responsibility to make sure that everyone else in a cascading fashion is advised. How Marafe does that, does he tell the sergeants or the subunit commanders or whatever? The important thing is, if the people at the front end don't know what the strategy is, there is no strategy. So therefore, there needs to be a reassurance that that gets all the way down to every single officer. Every single officer understands, because this is a dangerous operation. I mean, these are people who allegedly may have killed security guards and other miners during the course of the weekend, and are all heavily armed. So therefore, does everybody absolutely understand? I would have to say I'm aware of some of the issues in relation to, as you refer to, Chair, allegations that were made around this issue of General Mpembe, and you made reference to it in relation to Roots. I'm not aware, I would have to say, I haven't been made aware of the issue around that there has been potentially a conspiracy around with regards to lots of officers to construct their notebooks so that it looks as if it's Mpembe's fault. That's just not information that I've previously been privy to. But so I would say to you that if Mpembe issued that instruction through Marafe and received from Marafe an assurance that it had been properly communicated and whatever, then under those circumstances, it would be very, very difficult to point a finger of blame at General Mpembe. Indeed. The circumstances, the facts that I've engaged with, obviously, have been slightly different. So I have read statements that have been given to me by the South African Police Department, Officer XYZ, and these officers say something very different to that. As you say, it is your job, Chair, to work out what the truth of all of this is. But in offering an opinion, the one thing that I would say sort of beyond what I've already said is that I think that there is a statement, and I don't have the reference here now, but again, at the next break I'll certainly look for it, is that there is a statement from one officer who I think is relatively senior in all of this, and he makes some point around, if my memory serves me correct, and I'll ask for your indulgence about just checking this out at the next break, talks about it's when the tear gas is fired that he then says something along the lines of that, I then realised that General Mpembe didn't want us to let people into the informal settlement. That would suggest to me that up to that point he didn't know. That would suggest to me that up to that point, certainly he hadn't been properly briefed. Assuming that he's not part of the conspiracy, of course. But I only say it because I think, if memory serves me correctly, that he's a reasonably senior officer as opposed to perhaps these officers who might be constables or whatever it is. So, but I'm more than happy to check that reference.
Mr. White, do I understand that you've not been afforded an opportunity to read the transcript of the evidence of Colonel Marafe, where he talks about the briefing that was conducted on the 13th as regards the escorting?
I've seen some of the transcript of Mr. Marafe. I don't know that I've specifically seen that bit, but I'll be more than happy to go back and look at it. And certainly I've been directed to, and I have looked at the piece of oral evidence where Mr. Marafe talks about this dispute with regards to who's in charge, and he makes it crystal clear, as the chairman has already articulated. He then says, after dealing with that issue, there was no confusion. I absolutely.
Because it seems to me if you had access to it, you might have amended your criticism about the lack of briefing of the decision to escort.
Potentially on the part of General Mpembe, as
Yes.
I've already explained to the chairman. However, I would be saying, whilst it's not for me to decide on issues of fact, but the contrary to that was the numerous statements that I had read from officers who are actually therefore at the front end, who are engaged in this, who say something very different. And because I have not at this stage been made privy to this issue of this conspiracy of cover-up by them, so therefore I read those statements from police officers in the spirit of their police officers who are telling the truth.
Well, perhaps at some stage, if you might be afforded an opportunity to look at that evidence. It might inform your view about this. There might be the other situation as well of the clarity of the briefing, which is a completely different issue as to whether a briefing took place or not at all.
And again, I would respond by saying that a number of people don't make any mention of briefing. Sometimes police officers write bad statements, and that's not to say that therefore there was no briefing. I'm saying they don't make any mention of briefing. So the issue is, was there a briefing? Yes or no? Difficult to decide. But then beyond that, it's about the clarity of the briefing. And this is my point. This even escorting is potentially a dangerous operation. Police officers who are going to be engaged in that need to understand what the boss wants them to do in the way that he does it. And it may well be that Mpembe has communicated that through Marafi and depended on Marafi making sure that that was cascaded down. And if Marafi has come back and told him that that's fine and everybody knows what they're doing, then the fault is somewhere between Marafi and the front end as opposed to Mpembe, if that is the case.
And you are aware of the situation, Mr. White, in which the escorting had to take place. General Mpembe was counting down for them to lay down their weapons, and the group just stood up and carried on. And he took the decision to escort them. So he can't really be criticized for taking the time to make any substantial plan as regards that.
And again, Chair, when I refer to a dynamic plan, if the circumstances changed instantaneously, and then this is quite a big change in his decision, from disarm, here stationary, to now escort and move, but he has to make that in a matter of seconds. I fully understand that. That then becomes, how does that now get communicated? Because if the officers think we're supposed to keep these people stationary and disarm them, Mpembe then decides, well, actually the circumstances have changed, I need to do something different, so that those officers are not still trying to carry out instruction 1 when he now wants them to do instruction 2. How does that get communicated? Now, ordinarily, in my experience, it would be that maybe not even briefing Marafi, who goes on and tells everyone. It would be simply an instruction on the radio from General Marafi, or telling someone else to put an instruction on the radio that we're now going to have to escort these people. This is what we want to do.
And as regards it does appear as though General Mpembe took the decision to negotiate with the strikers, although he had some 70 armed policemen with him. And he did not choose to go the option of forcibly disarming. Now, in those circumstances, would you still criticize him for not having had a plan?
I don't know exactly what's in General Mpembe's head. But my view would be, if he's following the direction given by General Mabumbo, which is basically to go and deal with this group. And she talks about, we just can't have these armed groups wandering about. She's basically saying, go and disarm them. So that's what he's on his way to do. And with credit to General Mpembe, rather than some sort of massive tactical operation, he gives them the opportunity. He negotiates with them and gives them the opportunity to lay down their arms. And I congratulate him for that. I think, in terms of a concept of minimum use of force, that's exactly and entirely appropriate. But when he's travelling to the scene with this in mind, because again, he doesn't have hours to do it. I think they go from the instruction to actually arriving at the scene in somewhere like an hour and a half, an hour and 40 minutes, something like that. So during that period, I would have expected him to be given some thought to what it is that he wants to do. I would have thought that he would probably have had time to sort of commit some of that to paper, so that, again, it helps other people understanding. But if he doesn't, again, not overly critical of that. The point is that if he's going to, and it's always his intention to try and negotiate the lay down of the weapons, that's good. That's option A. One of the things I used to talk about all the time in terms of planning to my officers is, when we deal with a situation, how you're actually going to plan for the thing that you absolutely anticipate happening is the easy bit. What they pay you for is thinking about what if. So he doesn't have an awful lot of time, but actually, did he give consideration to, right, I'm going to go and negotiate. Now, what if they don't lay their weapons down? Still in the view that I'm going to have to carry out General Mabumbo's instruction, which is basically to disarm. So how are we going to do that then? Where is it that I want the officers to be? What's the best way to do that? Does he take tactical advice from someone, as I've explained earlier on, in the hour and a half or hour and 40 minutes that he does so? When he gets to the scene, because of the circumstances he's faced with, and often when you get to a scene and you're in that conversation and you can feel the tension, that's very different from the comfort of a command room or whatever. So he then makes this dynamic decision that actually the negotiation hasn't worked. We're not going to go to a forcible disarmament, because I think that could be potentially very dangerous. I'm assuming this is what he thought. Therefore, the lesser of two evils, we're now going to escort. But I still think in that period, when he's responding to Mabumbo's instruction, he's going to the scene thinking, I need to disarm these people. I'm saying, where's the evidence of planning with regards to what he was going to do as plan is basically option A, favourite option. What he was going to do if, and how they were going to do that, so that everyone knows. We're sending police officers today with a group of 200 or 300 people who are armed with spears, pangas, a dangerous operation. This is my point.
So a plan if option B was to forcibly disarm. That option B. Option A was to negotiate. If option B was to then forcibly disarm if negotiations did not work, then you would expect a plan to be made, some sort of a plan.
Yeah, absolutely. And,
yes.
And the evidence that I've engaged with, there was no evidence which was saying that there was a plan A to negotiate. That happens when General Mpembe gets there. He may well have worked all of this out in his mind. I suspect that he had. I'm saying, well, where's the evidence, therefore, of, well, what if? And I actually talk about in my statement that if the plan was around disarming, and certainly if you're going to forcibly disarm, then you nearly work up a scale with regards to how sophisticated and how much detail and how much you need to think about in relation to the plan. If from the outset the plan was we're going to escort these people, and we know that there had been a previous interaction with security guards where the crowd had been reasonably compliant. So if from the word go it was that we were going to just simply escort them from where they were back to the copy, not try and take the arms off them, then the likelihood is maybe they might have been compliant in relation to that. So therefore, the level of detail and how you need to communicate that with people on a sliding scale probably reduces some. But still, I would have expected, I certainly would have wanted anybody working for me to say, okay, so at the outset I'm planning to arrive here, tell the people that they can't stay in this position. We're not going to try and take their arms off them. They're traditional weapons. We're not going to interfere with that. And we're now going to escort you back to the copy. I anticipate they're going to comply with that. And my challenge to people would be, well, what if? What if they don't? Then what are you going to do? And again, we're not back to the photocopier and a bound plan and all the rest of it, but it's about clearly thinking about the what-ifs. I think this is, from a police command point of view, this is what they pay you for.
Thank you, Mr. White.
I can understand that point, but there's another point that follows from that. You criticise him for not planning properly for how he would go about disarming if that had to happen. And it may well be that you're right, that there was a failure to plan properly for that contingency. But, of course, if he then decided not to try to disarm because he realised it couldn't happen without a serious risk of bloodshed, and to go to the next stage, which is escorting them back to the copy, and then subject to what happened thereafter, which we can leave aside for the moment, surely there's a lack of a causal link between the initial failure to which you referred, assuming there was such a failure, assuming he should have planned, he didn't properly, to disarm, and how he would disarm. If that plan was abandoned and no attempt was made to implement it, and what went wrong thereafter took place in the escorting exercise through insubordination and so forth, by people who knew very well what they were supposed to be doing, then there wouldn't be a causal connection between the failure to which you referred to plan properly and what happened. Well, that must be right, surely.
Chairman, I absolutely agree with you. Absolutely. Could I just, for a point of clarification, perhaps read something from my statement? This is a paragraph 5.2, point 11, sort of halfway down. If, and I stress if, I wasn't there, I don't know. I can only sort of look at the evidence and try and give an opinion from that. If the intention in those circumstances was to forcibly disarm and disperse the protesters, then the operation needed to be planned, and it was foolhardy to attempt the disarmament without careful planning. Full stop. However, if the intention was simply to escort them in order to protect others from the potential attacks, then a detailed plan may not have been necessary, but a clear briefing of what the of that intention was. So, I would raise the point that, given that General Mpembe is going to carry out the order of General Mabumbo, which says basically disarm. So, for the reasons that we've discussed, I'm saying I think he should have been planning for that and planning for the what-ifs. He then gets there and is then going to negotiate with them. That's still part of, should have been sort of option A within the plan. At the point that he then changes his mind and says, given all of the circumstances, situational appropriateness, I'm now changing my mind. We're moving very much to plan B, completely, which is just simply to escort. Then absolutely, you're right. There is no causal connection around the failure to plan for that. But I make my point. If the intention is just simply to escort, well then still, there's a requirement for a proper briefing so that the people who are going to do the escorting understand what General Mpembe wants. That one, we are going to escort them, and two, if he had thought ahead and realised that there's a potential danger point in relation to the informal settlement, and I don't want them to go there, communicating that as well. As I've engaged with the evidence, as I said, not aware of this issue around conspiracy, that perhaps all of these police officers are, for reasons best known to themselves, telling lies. I've read all of these statements from the officers who are in the roles that I've described, who are saying, I wasn't briefed, I didn't get a sort of briefing at the beginning of this, and actually this is what the instruction was. I took that on face value.
Yes, look, clearly what you say must be right on the assumptions you make. If, on the other hand, the officers or the members of the police members who were there knew very well what was supposed to happen, and they, either alone or on instruction from somebody else, deliberately deviated from that, and that caused the trouble. And you can't blame Mpembe for that. And the criticism then doesn't apply. You have to be able to find, even if there wasn't proper briefing, you've got to be able to find there was a causal connection between that. And if they knew very well their job was to escort and not to fire tear gas and not to fire stun grenades, and if the tear gas and the stun grenades would cause the trouble, and they knew very well they didn't receive it, well, this is obviously if there was no order given by Mpembe, then of course it's a different situation, isn't it?
Chair, let me say for the record, I thought long and hard about whether or not I would want to be involved in this whole process, from the point of view that I was a police officer for 30 years, as I've described earlier on, in very, very difficult circumstances. And I had lots of experience where people came after the fact and sort of, reviewed and tried to second guess, so, and having been a police officer for 30 years, and I've had the privilege of going to many different countries, and there's an element of, cops are cops are cops, there's a sort of fraternity. So I thought long and hard about all of this, in terms of engaging with evidence which potentially would show some criticisms, and whether or not I was prepared to stand up and say that. So, I didn't enter into this process wanting to criticise any individual officer or the SABC as an organisation. As I've engaged with the evidence, I've made these criticisms of General Mpembe, who is the commander of this particular operation, for the reasons that I've said. For the record, if the circumstances are actually, and it's your job, Chair, as you've rightly said, to discover the truth of all of this, if the truth is that Mpembe was responding to a direction by his boss to go and disarm this group, and he had thought through a plan as to how he was going to do this, and his initial option was to negotiate. He gets to the scene, he negotiates, and that doesn't work. He makes an instantaneous judgment that actually the safest thing for everyone is basically that we're then going to escort this group back to the copy where they had intended to go, or whatever it was. He communicates that intention to his second in command and asks him to make sure that all of the officers are aware, or he gives that instruction on the radio, but he satisfies himself that all of the officers are perfectly aware of what he wants them to do in the way that he wants them to do it. And actually, in fairness to General Mpembe, he's foresighted enough to think about there's a potential danger point at the informal settlement. I don't want people to go there, and gives that instruction as well. And then as people start to progress, and we know that for some considerable distance, this is exactly what happens. The police are moving along on either side of them, they're being escorted, and then something happens because Kuhn or some other officer disobeys that order, acts independently, and as a result of which this fracas arises where tragically 2 police officers are killed, another one seriously injured, and 3 minors are shot.
And there's a problem about the third one, how that happened, but it doesn't affect the thrust of the point you're making.
Sorry, Chairperson, the latest post-mortem evidence is the 3 minor, that it's not a stab wound, it's a bullet wound.
My apologies anyway, Chair.
I'm sorry, I was trying to correct you, but I've been corrected apparently. So anyway, the point I was making, it doesn't affect the thrust of your point anyway.
And the thrust of my point is simply this. This is a tragic event for all concerned, including the South African Police Department themselves, who have lost 2 colleagues and one, as I understand, quite seriously injured. The point is, and as I said, preface this particular part of my evidence, for the record, could I ascribe any blame to Major General Pembe in those circumstances? No, I couldn't. No, I couldn't. Because it would seem to me that he's done what he is expected to do, if those are the circumstances.
Mr. White, may I just inquire how many statements you will refer to on which you base the opinion that there was no briefing as regards the escorting?
Chair, at least 9. And then I've said, if you will indulge me, I'll just see if I can check this other reference as well.
And that doesn't include Colonel Marafi's?
No.
Thank you.
There's a footnote in your report where you quote these things, I think. But anyway, I read it last night, but I'll find it again later. I think this is a suitable stage for us to take the tea adjournment. 15 minutes? Commission resumes. Mr. White, you're still under oath. Ms. LaRue.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, in the adjournment, Mr. White indicated two issues that he wanted to clarify for the Commission. I'd just like to deal with that before we continue. Mr. White, firstly, it was to provide the Commission with the reference. You in your evidence, described a senior officer's evidence around on the 13th. Chair, we've managed to identify that as Captain Tupe QQ9. QQ9.
QQ9.
It's his consolidated statement.
Right, thank you.
Mr. White, the specific reference, if you'd like to just give that to the Chair, that you were relying on.
Yes, Chair, it's QQQ9 and the paragraph is 6.3. I don't know if it's helpful to you that you want me to read out the particular...
sentence or two you want to read is relevant. You might as well read it out now.
No, I won't read the whole paragraph, Chair. So basically he says, I heard Warrant Officer Kuhn asking the General whether he should shoot tear gas and he repeated, yes, shoot. I did not hear any command to throw a stun grenade. I immediately thought his idea was to prevent the strikers from penetrating the informal settlement. So my interpretation of that was therefore that Captain Tupe makes the assessment around the informal settlement in live time. Clearly, the assumption is that he wasn't previously aware of that. And the only reason that I make reference to that particular piece of it is the fact that, again, I've been unsighted to the issues that you talked about earlier on, Chair, but the fact that it is a relatively senior officer.
Yes, no, I understand that. Of course, but if we approach the matter on the basis that General Mpembe is telling the truth, he says he didn't give instruction to shoot, then this paragraph is false. Equally, of course, if we believe Captain Tupe, then what General Mpembe says is false. But that's why it depends on which factual finding you make and which of the witnesses you believe. But we were discussing the matter on the assumption, which, as I pointed out, may not be correct, but on the assumption that General Mpembe is telling the truth. If General Mpembe is telling the truth, he didn't give the instruction, then Captain Tupe's evidence that he gave the instruction and the things that follow from that aren't true.
Absolutely, Chair, and that's why I said, for the record, if General Mpembe's evidence is true, and that's an issue for you to work out, then for the reasons that I said, and I set out very clearly step by step, then would my criticism of General Mpembe around the 13th stand? No, it wouldn't, if under all of those circumstances.
No, I understand that. That's clear. And that's the first
yes, and then,
correction or amplification he wishes to make.
Yes, and then secondly, Chair, Mr. White raised with me in the adjournment, he seems to have misunderstood a question from Commissioner Hemraj and would like to have the opportunity to correct that.
Of course he can do so.
Okay. Just before the break, Commissioner, you asked me a question around how many statements I had referred to, and I think I give you the answer 9 because you could see me actually counting these up. I assumed that you were asking me, when I was quoting that evidence, how many statements was I referring to in these notes here? And the answer to that is 9. I was blissfully unaware that I'd misinterpreted your question, or at least my legal team think that I have misinterpreted your question, which, if I'm correct in saying, was actually, in coming to this overall judgment, how many statements had you referred to? If that's the question, the answer is not 9. The answer is, I don't exactly know the exact figure, but I am confident that I've read all of the statements you know, the police have provided for the events on the 13th. I don't know the exact figure of that, but I read a lot of statements.
Except Colonel Marafi's.
No, I've read 4 statements from Colonel Marafi.
His evidence. Did you read the transcript of his evidence?
No, what I've said to you, Chair, in my evidence earlier on is I have read some transcript evidence from Colonel Marafi. I know specifically I read the bit around this issue vis-a-vis who's in charge and whether it should be a POP commander. And I'd taken a note of that because I know that Marafi says specifically after that issue was resolved, there was no confusion. I specifically remember that. The other issue in relation to his oral evidence vis-a-vis the escorting, I would have to say, I may have read it. I have read a lot of material over this last while. And also because I'm reading information in relation to people who obviously I've never met, sometimes it's hard to sort of, so my assurance to you was that with a longer break, either tonight or perhaps at lunchtime, I will go and read that. So I couldn't say for certain is the honest answer to that.
These 9 statements support the view that there was no briefing.
Yes, and that's what I was referring to just there and then.
Yes, I understand
But I made that assessment on the basis of having read all of the statements, and these are the ones I took notes of because I thought, well, that's noteworthy, that's odd that these are saying that.
And there might be other statements that do say there were briefings.
I would be confident, I'd stand to be corrected in this, and I'd be confident that probably not, because my engagement with this process, as I explained earlier on, I was a bit reluctant to get involved in the process in the first instance, is not to find fault with the South African police. Absolutely not. So therefore, if there was a statement, I think, that was saying specifically, I was briefed, here's the circumstances of my briefing, etc., 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 then I'm sure that I would have taken a note of that as contrary evidence. It may well be that the other ones are relatively neutral with regards to this. And I also made the point in relation to my evidence earlier on that I make reference to the fact that in a lot of these statements they talk about no mention of any briefing. Now that's not to say that they said I wasn't briefed. I'm taking a note that in the statement that they give, they don't say anything about a briefing. Maybe they were and it's a bad statement. I don't know that bit. But the particular piece of evidence that I thought was useful to me was the fact that they then said, General Mpembe told us to do X, Y, or Z, which is contrary to the evidence of General Mpembe, and that's why I was taking a note of it. I fully accept that this evidence might be under question, and if that's the case, then I refer back to the remarks I gave earlier on.
Thank you, Mr. White. Moving on to the final theme relating to the 13th of August, with respect to accountability for the operation on the 13th. Do you have any comment or conclusions you'd like to place before the Commission in that regard?
Yes, Chair. Accountability is one of the themes I've mentioned, and I'll certainly, I'm sure, I'll be talking to you more about this at a later stage. So, in interest of being brief, just simply 2 points. One, it relates to the issue that we've just been talking about, that I was struck by the sort of the overall quality of the statements. In terms of accountability, I would have expected to see much better statements in much more detail, particularly in an incident where 5 people die, including two police officers. So that's a sort of a general comment in relation to the quality of statements in terms of the detail that they provide with regards to what happened. The second issue that struck me in relation to the 13th is I don't see any evidence, and again I stand to be corrected, around any sort of debrief for that incident. Now I know that a number of police officers went to see what I would refer to as occupational health and welfare. I can't remember the specific title it's used, but you know, it's around sort of helping police officers deal with sort of, you know, the psychological aspects of being involved in a very traumatic incident. So I make the point that I know that that happened. But in terms of an operational briefing, in order to try and sort of identify lessons and what had gone wrong, again, I stress, with all due respect to the families of the miners who were killed, but even from the point of view of 2 police officers being killed and 1 has been seriously injured, you know, to do a debrief with regards to what has happened here, you know, to learn lessons, given this is an ongoing situation, to make sure that the same things don't happen again. I was surprised that I didn't see any evidence of that.
Mr. White, unless the Commission have any further questions on the 13th, I intend to move to the operation of the 16th. Mr. White, thank you, Chair. Mr. White, your final statement summarizes your overall conclusions with respect to the 16th in part that set out page 125, part 10. Could you briefly highlight the particular issues that you intend to deal with respect to your opinions about the operation of the 16th? And then, in turn, we'll take each of those. But if you could just give us your list of issues you'd like to address with respect to the 16th.
So is this page 125, paragraph 10.1.1b, is it? A and B?
Yes, Chair, that is where Mr. White comes to his final conclusions.
A, B, all the way down to...
Yes, Chair, and continuing on the next 2 pages. But Mr. White, for the purposes of your oral evidence, if you could identify the issues you'd like to address on the 16th.
Again, Chair, I'd refer to the remarks I gave earlier on, and looking at this through the lens of issues in relation to intelligence, planning, briefing, command and control, accountability, and on this particular issue, some specific issues in relation to tactics.
Now, Mr. White, you're obviously aware that the SAPS case before the Commission is that all deaths on the 16th were caused by individual members making their own judgment to fire shots in self or private defence. So what is the relevance for the Commission of assessing intelligence planning, briefing, tactical issues such as in your statement you referred to the rationale for moving in or the deployment of the TRT and command and control? Why should the Commission be concerned about those questions when the SAPS case is a self-defence, private defence case?
Well, I think the very simple answer to that is that if police officers are in a position where they act in private defence, and again, whether they were justified in doing so is certainly not a matter for me, that's a matter for the Commission. But the fact remains that police officers found themselves in a position where they had to exercise that judgment. I don't think that you can isolate that question and just simply then say, yes or no, was it justified? I think from the point of view of the organisation, you then have to say, well, why were those officers there? You know, it was the police service that caused those officers to be in that particular place at that particular time. Individual officers have to be able to give an account of if they fired a shot, you know, what it was they fired at, the circumstances in which they fired it, and it's up to someone other than me to decide whether or not that was justified. The reason that I say that in looking at the 16th, I'm looking at issues of intelligence, planning, briefing, and the same issues that I've highlighted before, is that the question for the organisation and the question for people in command positions is, why were they in that position? Why did Officer X find himself or herself in the position where therefore they had to fire their gun? Because that, I think, is part of understanding what happened and whether or not it could have been avoided.
Well, I understood that one of your main points, I understand one of your main points, is that the reasons given for going over to the tactical option, as it was called, on the Thursday were not adequate. You criticised that very strongly in various parts of your report. So I take it you say that if the tactical option should not have happened or be taken, if you take an option, on the Thursday, then, and they'd waited till the Friday, then obviously the deaths that took place on the Thursday wouldn't have taken place. I take it that's, even if those who died in circumstances where those responsible for their deaths were acting in self or private defence. Is that a summary of one of the main points you make?
Well, I think the simple answer to that is, Chair, and I'm not trying to avoid it, is that, you know, I don't know. What I'm saying is, and I'm more than happy to go through as we work through the process to give you detailed sort of consideration on this, is that I do question highly the decision to go, and I don't use this terminology again as terminology that I've adopted in relation to the context, to go tactical at in and around 3:30 p.m. on the Thursday afternoon. I do question why that was the case and question that very, very strongly. After that decision is made, we know that a lot of people are killed. Is there an absolute causal connection between the two? I can only offer you the benefit of my experience, and hopefully that's of some value in you trying to work out whether or not there's an absolute causal connection between the two. Had they have waited to the next day in order to carry out some other type of tactical plan early the next morning, would all of those 34 people have died? I don't know. Maybe there might have been another set of circumstances that sort of presented whereby maybe more people would have died, maybe less people would have died. I simply don't know. But I do think that what we have to deal with are the circumstances as they evolved and changed, and then question decisions that are being made at that time, given all of the information that's available. And this is why I start off with the whole point around intelligence, and trying to understand, like I say, why decisions were made, the circumstances in which they were made, the consideration being given to the consequence of those decisions in terms of plotting a line as to how this situation developed.
Simply put, if you want to adopt the but-for approach to causation, and you take out the decision to go tactical, as you put it, as they put it, on the Thursday, it follows that the people who died on Thursday wouldn't have died on Thursday. They might have died later. Others may have died, more, fewer. But the deaths on the Thursday, in the circumstances in which they took place, wouldn't have happened if the decision to go tactical on the Thursday had not been made. And I take it that's a part of the opinion you've expressed. Is that correct?
Chair, all I can say is I think it was a questionable decision. I've offered that up in my provisional statement. I've said it in my final statement. I still adhere to that point in my supplementary statement. I'm prepared to give oral evidence to that effect. I think it was a hugely questionable decision. The consequences of taking another decision, would that have meant that no one would have died that day? Well, I simply don't know. I would need to understand then, well, if they didn't take that decision and they did that instead or this instead, well, then potentially what might have happened, I just simply, I don't know.
Mr. White, taking you back to the question I asked you, which is why do we look at planning, briefing, command and control, intelligence, etc.? Why do you do that in your statement? Is there a legal basis in your experience, or in Northern Ireland, as to why you don't just question why the particular individual officer fired the rounds that they did, but you look at why they were in that position?
There is a legal basis, Chair, and it comes from the R.V. McCann case, which went to the European Court of Human Rights, which was the case where British Army SAS shot 3 people in Gibraltar. The implications of that, therefore, legally are that, whilst my understanding of the case is that the individual soldiers who shot, the Human Rights Court found in their favour that they couldn't be criticised as such for what they did, but the criticisms were aimed at the people who were involved in planning. In other words, why were they put in the position that they were put? So that's a legal basis. However, there's a procedural basis as well, certainly in the context that I worked in. Police Service in Northern Ireland have their own code of ethics. And 4.2 of the code of ethics says that when commanders are planning operations, they will do so with regard to minimising the use of force. Now, again, if you look at something like General Order 262 here, which talks about trying to avoid use of force at all costs. So the reason that I think this question is being asked is going back to this point about, in looking at the situation that happened on the 16th, either at scene 1 or scene 2, it is not sufficient to just simply say, was Officer X justified, yes or no, in the circumstances that he or she faced at that time? Yes, that's a very important question to ask.
It's not the only one.
But absolutely it's not the only one.
Mr. LaRue, may I ask you whether it would be possible at some stage, before we finish with the Commission, for you to give us copies of that judgment of the European Court in the McCann case? I remember reading about it at the time it happened, but if you can do that, I would appreciate it.
Yes, Chair, we'll do that.
But Chair, just to finish that point, the case itself and then subsequently policy that has been adopted, makes it very clear that if you're in a command position, you're involved in planning an operation, then you equally have the responsibility that officer has with regards to the use of force. All of our policies, and I think we'll come back to this at a later stage, vis-a-vis the homework that you sent me around looking at this particular policy document. But just to briefly say, in the UK, all of the policy documents around the use of firearms and use of force are written in the context of the police officer makes an individual choice, but it's within a framework of authority levels. So, authority at certain senior officer level for firearms to be deployed to a certain situation, and then that officer has to be accountable for why he gave that authority and the circumstances in which he did it. So individual police officer has to account for his or her actions. That's the person pulling the trigger, but it's also their supervisor at the scene. It's also all the way up to, as I explained earlier on, the gold commander, the silver commander, the bronze commander, and everyone else that has a direct line of responsibility for that.
Mr. White, if I could ask you to turn to page 26 of your supplementary statement. And in particular, section 3.3. This is where the SAPs set out fairly crisply that the opinion of Mr. White that the Marikana tragedy occurred because of poor planning, poor briefing, and most importantly, poor decision-making is contested. SAPs contend that had the attack on the police at scene 1 not occurred, the tragedy would not have happened. Now, Could you summarise for the Commission what you then say in response to that? Because this is sort of the heart of the dispute between...
Sorry, what page?
Page 26 of the supplementary statement.
That's quadruple B4, page 20.
Yes, Chair. And Mr. White, in due course we'll deal with the evidence of Mr. X, but if we could just deal with the way the SAPs frame the issue here, that there's an attack on the police. We're not engaging with the details of the Mr. X evidence at this stage.
Yeah, Chair, if you can indulge me, I'd prefer to read this just so that there's an accurate representation of what I'm saying. So the answer at 3.3.2 is that this appears to be the crux of the issue between SAPS and myself. I'm aware that there's conflicting evidence over whether the strikers were in fact attacking the police at scene 1. I'm not qualified to resolve that conflict, and I accept that there is evidence on both sides. But on the assumption that the strikers were attacking at scene 1, as contended for by the SAPS, it is my opinion that A. It is clear that the movement of the strikers towards the kraal was prompted by the commencement of the stage 3 of the SAPS operation. B. There was no adequate rationale to launch stage 3 at 15:30 hours on the 16th of August. C. The planning of stage 3 of the operation was poor and included a deployment of SAPS members which increased the risk and likelihood of the need to use lethal force. D. The briefing of the stage 3 operation appears to have been poor, so that a number of key players, including those who were rolling out the barbed wire and those who were operating the water cannon, were uncertain of their role. E. The decision to send a line of in and around 60 TRT members forward to confront the strikers, each with the discretion to fire in self-defence, increased the risk of an excessive response to any lethal threat. And also F. The response to the lethal threat appears to have been disproportionate.
Mr. White, if we can now start by going through your analysis and conclusions that you draw around the operation of the 16th and using the framework that you've already identified for the Commission. If we start with intelligence, could you explain for the Commission your key criticisms in respect to intelligence and the operation on the 16th?
Chair, in the interest of brevity, and I'm seeking your guidance on this, I raised some issues in relation to intelligence in relation to the 13th. Most of those were more general as opposed to specifically to the 13th. Some of them were specific. Rather than repeat those again, I just make the point that some of those issues were general, i.e. the TT5 and the fact that there was very little actionable intelligence on that. So therefore then, at this part of the evidence, in addition to those remarks, I would then say that specifically in relation to the operation on the 16th, some of the intelligence is inaccurate. In that, specifically, I would point to TT4, which are the minutes of the JOC meeting at 6 a.m. And the issues here are that, first of all, the information that's recorded as being the intelligence for that meeting is exactly the same, and I'm pretty confident word for word, that is recorded as the intelligence input at the following JOC meeting, which took place at 13:30 hours on the 16th. And the reason that I raise this is because within that intelligence it talks about 3,000 people on the copy at 6 a.m. Now I am aware that there has been some suggestion that this might have been a typographical error, and in fact that there were only, it should have said 300. But there are two other pieces of evidence which point to the fact that at in and around 8:50 a.m., I think one from the occurrence book and two from Lieutenant Colonel Scott, at around 8:50 a.m. there was in and around 100 people on the copy at that time. I haven't seen any evidence through reading all of these statements that at any stage the natural pattern is that lots of people gather up in the copy and then lots of people leave. So I think the logical conclusion is that if they're in and around 100 people at around 8:59 a.m. on the copy, then it's extremely unlikely there would have been 300 sort of earlier on at 6 a.m. So I don't know if it's a typographical issue, but even at that, as I say, it appears to be exactly the same intelligence which is then on offered to the JOC for the 13:30.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. You're now actually testifying in relation to what appears at pages 59 to 61 of your final report.
Yes, Chair. Sorry, apologies. That's correct.
Yes, Chair.
That's the issue that deals with it.
Yeah, no. I just mentioned that for the help us later when we read the transcript of your evidence to realise that you're referring to points that are made more fully on those pages of your final report.
Sorry, apologies. I maybe should have tried to be more helpful earlier on, because I think that you had originally talked to Ms. LaRue around paragraph 10 of my statement, but I think that was just in relation to the overall conclusions.
Correct.
So my apologies for not directing you back to it. Yes,
Dealing with inadequate intelligence at paragraph 6.2 of your final report.
that's correct.
Beginning at page 59.
That's correct, Chair.
Mr. White, other than the inaccuracy of the intelligence that was available, could you summarize your comment, your criticism on how the intelligence was then, what role it then played in the operation?
Can I ask you a question that's been worrying me about this point from the time I first read your report? And that is, I think the police case is, I'm not sure whether they've articulated it as fully as I'm articulating it now, but I think the police case is that there were great difficulties in getting intelligence. There was a climate of intimidation and so forth, and they had handlers who then had informers, and they were getting some information from them, but it's implicit, I think, in what they say is that it was very difficult to get information. Now, I can understand that in a long-standing situation such as you have in Northern Ireland, you probably have informers embedded in the various factions who presumably are a regular supplier, who regularly supply information. And one's read reports about grasses and supergrasses and so on. We won't have to go there now. But where you have industrial unrest arising with relatively unprecedented levels of, sorry, it is alleged, I must hasten to say, relatively unprecedented levels of violence, murder and mayhem and intimidation and so forth. I'm not sure that it's so easy for the police to have informers in place. They then presumably have to approach people who are there already to get information from them, which is also not so easy. So I'm not sure, I just want to give you a chance to deal with this. I'm not sure that you've dealt in your report with the reasons for saying that one can blame the police for inadequate intelligence. That there was inadequate intelligence is one thing, but whether it's something that you can lay at the police's door in these circumstances is another. Now, there may be an answer to that, but it wasn't immediately apparent to me, and I thought I should put it to you so you can assist me. One other fact, I'm reminded to remind you that the evidence is that the 10th person who died before the 16th was Mr. Twala, who was an official of NUM. I can't remember what exactly his role was. He was a shop steward or shaft steward or something of that kind. And the evidence seems to indicate, certainly what Mr. X says about him, which of course may not be true. He hasn't been cross-examined yet. But according to his statement, Twala was found in possession of a cell phone with a lot of airtime on it, and the suggestion was that the implicit suggestion is that he was giving information to NUM, and that may well have been the reason, or more presumably was the reason why he was killed. Whether that evidence is true or not is another matter, but certainly he was killed in circumstances which indicate there must have been a reason for it. And if he was a striker and he was a NUM member, one can draw one's own inference. So anyway, I just mentioned that. You have a climate of intimidation, a climate of violence, a climate of what I've called several times murder and mayhem. It's not a long-standing sectarian dispute that's endured for centuries, where the Royal Ulster Constabulary and their successors in title have been able to establish information channels, if I can use that word, such as you have in Northern Ireland. So I could imagine the police saying, by all means, tell us we must have adequate information, but we'd be kind enough to tell us how we can do it, regard being had to the sort of problems that we encountered. Anyway, that's the point that I'd like you to deal with.
Chair, I have read statements from police officers in the intelligence branch where they talk about difficulties in getting intelligence, I wouldn't dispute that at all. I'm sure that it is difficult, and maybe the circumstances are very different for exactly the reasons that you articulate vis-a-vis the position in Northern Ireland and long-standing and covert human intelligence sources being sort of there. I know that some of the evidence from the SABC is that there was an attempt to have an informer effectively placed. Whether or not that was subsequently the person that you refer to, I'm sure you will never be confirmed, and that's not the business of anybody in a public realm. Please don't talk about that, and rightly so. So the issue is that, in a general sense, I'm looking at the circumstance from the 9th to the 16th of August. TT5, or TTT5, correct me, but the composite of the intelligence, I gave evidence earlier on, has 2, possibly 3 entries which I would consider to be actual actionable intelligence. So I make the point that an ongoing operation which has taken place over the course of a week, that there are only these 2 pieces of actual intelligence, struck me as extremely surprising. I don't for one second suggest that there weren't difficulties in gathering intelligence, but it strikes me as extremely surprising that it's not more than that. I have engaged with the statement from a particular police officer within the intelligence branch, and he talks about in that some of the other mechanisms that he used, including I think they take still photographs of people on the copy, and they take them back to the I think they interrogate the Loman's HR database and whatever. I would ask the question, well, so what? As a result of that, what happened? Were you able to identify people, and was that then fed back in? Because it doesn't say anything in terms of TTT5. He also talks about interviewing people, including security guards and witnesses and whatever, some of whom he says only engage with them on the basis that their names were kept anonymous, and I can absolutely understand that. But again, I ask the question, well, so what? Well, what was the outcome of those conversations, and what did you do with it? Because I go back to TTT5 with regards to this is a composite of all of the intelligence. So I have no issue with the fact that they may have had difficulties. I still come back to the point that of that whole week, given the nature of this operation, given that 10 people have died, given the fact that the police are taking the decision to engage with a crowd of around 3,000 people, including a group of 300 who would seem to be are armed and have certain intent, it strikes me as extremely odd that there are 2/3 pieces of actionable intelligence. Not only that, Lieutenant Colonel Scott, in terms of some of his statements where he talks through the planning process, asks for information. He actually issues what I would recognise as what's called an intelligence requirement. He basically says, and again, I don't have the reference ready to hand, but it's in his statement, Chair, where he talks about, he asked for information in relation to what the general picture is in terms of the informal settlement, I think it is, and he wants to know that. He's looking for tension indicators. I suspect that that's about police officers who might occasionally patrol that area or might know some people. That's about actively going out and talking to people and trying to get a sense of, how the community and the informal settlement are seeing all of this. All of this information, some of it might be irrelevant, some of it might be of very little value, but some of it actually might be of value. The important point is that Scott recognises that and asks for that, but yet gives oral evidence to say that no information was ever communicated back to him.
It's 2 points that occur to me in that regard, and that is, the evidence is, I think, that a special group of detectives was brought in from Gauteng, and their job was to go through the still photographs, identify faces of people, particularly, I suppose, those bearing dangerous weapons, go back to Lonman, ask them to say who they were, if they could identify them, as you say, you mentioned that. Then get the addresses of these people. And then you remember part of the plan was to have a cordon and search. And presumably the idea would have been once you have a list of people who've got dangerous weapons and their addresses, you can then do your cordon and search and hopefully seize the weapons in their homes, which would substantially reduce the danger of dangerous weapons being used on the copy. Apart from that, there's evidence of General Mpembe on the Wednesday night, the night before the killings. A request he addressed to Mr. Zakwana, obviously in ignorance of what was being decided at the National Management Forum as they were speaking, that the tactical option would be exercised come what may on Thursday if the weapons weren't handed down. What Mpembe said to Zakwana, I don't know if you read that transcript of their discussion. Zakwana said to him, why don't you go and take the weapons away? And he said, you can't do it. You can't. There's no way you can take weapons or an axe from a man on a koppie if you've got a rifle. You'll have bloodshed. The way you've got to deal with it is you Zakwana, get your new members to come back to me and tell me which people in the hostels and the informal settlement have got weapons and who they are. And we will then go and get the weapons from them. Zakwana said, we'll do that, but you mustn't say that we get the information from you. What obviously happened thereafter was there wasn't time for that information to come back, to be fed into the plan and implemented perhaps in the cordon and search because of the decision made on the Wednesday night at the National Management Forum that tomorrow is the day when we're going to go to the tactical option if they don't lay the weapons down voluntarily. So those two things I put to you are relevant, obviously, in relation to the information they had or were hoping to get and the use they were going to make of it. It does seem as if, and this is just a view that obviously one's got to think about, I'm not saying this is so, but it seems as if one of the problems with going over to the tactical option on Thursday was the attempts that had been made to get information which could be used in a cordon and search to disarm the people. The Thursday decision was made, the decision to proceed on Thursday was premature with the consequences that followed. The application for cordon and search had been made. They were going to proceed, I think, on the Thursday night to do the necessary, obviously based on information that they were hoping to get. I take it partly from people they thought would be arrested on the Thursday, but also as a result of these two other initiatives that I mentioned. Now, all these are relevant in regard to criticism addressed to the police in relation to inadequate information and intelligence and the use or non-use thereof. Would you care to comment?
Can I just add one thing to that? As regards to the request pertaining to the geography of the area, Colonel Scott's request, I understand there was evidence that Mr. Sinclair from Lonmin was of great assistance to him in orienting him to the area.
And again, that may be so, and I took that to be around, sort of the configuration of the area, and I think he helped in the early stages of sort of Colonel Scott drawing up his plan. But what I was referring to, just to address this particular point first, is that Colonel Scott seems to be asking for intelligence. He's asking for what I would call, atmosphere information, community tension indicators from the point of view of, when we start to roll a plan out, how are people going to respond to this? And his evidence was that he didn't get any of that back. To come back to your point, Chair, yes, I've read that transcript. I'm aware of all of that, and I'm sure we'll come back to this point over the next couple of days around what was said at that meeting by General Mpembe vis-a-vis if you go on to the copy and bloodshed and all of that, which obviously, again, draws into question this whole issue of the decision on Thursday. However, again, as I've said at the opening, I do not for one second deny that I'm sure there were difficulties in all of this. And certainly General Mpembe has asked that information is brought back. And obviously then that information coming back would have post-stated what happened. I accept all of that. But I'm still coming back to the point that difficulties and all, that there are 2/3 pieces of actionable intelligence. And I'm more than happy to engage with the statement of, I think it's Officer, I apologise, I can't remember his rank, Victor, who talks about a lot of these things around what they did. And my basically response to be, well, if you did all of that, I'm assuming that got some information. What did you do with it? Because, as I've said earlier on, I've been told that TT5 represents a composite of, and so I have based this criticism on the fact that, are you telling me this is the intelligence for an operation of this magnitude across a whole week? We all have difficulties, but there are certain things which I still think that you would have expected to see moved across into, Because somewhere, maybe this intelligence exists somewhere. Maybe it does. And maybe my criticisms are entirely wrong. Look, I am aware of the things, everything that you've mentioned to me, Chair, I am aware of. But it seems to me that then maybe there's a breakdown in the machine as well, because this is not getting to the people who are making the decisions.
What went to the people making the decision, or the person making the decision, it's a question that we still have to decide who made the decision on the Wednesday night, whether it was Mbombo alone or whatever. And there's a piece of evidence that she gave herself on that point that's maybe relevant. But if all the information they had was what's in TT4, triple T4, then wasn't that enough to, well, it may well be contended, in the light of that information, to decide to do what the decision was, to proceed to the tactical option on the Thursday, knowing they didn't want to give up their weapons, they wouldn't give them up, they didn't want to be dislodged from the copy, and they'd fight to the death. That was, in itself, was powerful information, was it not?
Chair, I'm absolutely conscious of the fact that you know the evidence much better than I. But just on your last point, my understanding of the evidence from TTT4 was that 3,000 people on the copy, they wouldn't give up their weapons and they would resist the police. I don't know if the evidence, I don't know if the intelligence that the jock were taking the decisions on was actually specifically saying would fight to the death, but certainly would resist. Chair, yeah. All the more reason then I would have thought to think about, is this a good idea to move forward against a crowd of in and around 3,500, even if we identify that it's only these 300 people who will, following this line of questioning, fight to the death. I would have thought that the sensible decision, therefore, is actually we just need to hold on a little bit, because, as Gentleman Pemby said in the meeting that you referred to the night before, if we go on with, we have our rifles and they have, an axe, I think
Axes,
he said, there's likely to be bloodshed.
Yes, I seem to remember, this is what puts me about Advocate Hemraj, that apart from TTT4, sorry, is it TTT4? TT4, it's TT4, it's two T's. T total 4. The statement of Brigadier Engelbrecht seems to suggest that there was considerably more information. But he talks about handlers and they were regularly receiving information. So that hasn't been given to us. So we don't know. Well, we don't know the details of what was given, and he hasn't testified, but he simply told us that they did get information. Of course, there's a further problem, which I think you touch on elsewhere in your report, and that is the decision was taken on the Wednesday night that they would proceed to the tactical option on the Thursday if the weapons weren't handed down voluntarily. And I think the evidence is that that decision was taken in ignorance of the intelligence information. In other words, come what may, if the weapons aren't handed down on Thursday, we're going to go to the tactical option. We don't know what the intelligence says, and we leave it to the JOCOM to decide how they must do it. That it will be done has been decided. They must do the how. Now, I think you criticise that quite strongly, but it also has a bearing on the question of the criticism of the intelligence. It seems to me there's more intelligence that we haven't been told about. We just in broad terms we were told there's intelligence. But it does seem, prima facie, as if the intelligence didn't have any bearing on the decision anyway.
Chair, I'm very grateful to you.
It's put to me that we don't know that the intelligence wasn't taken into account, but it's an inference which may be drawn, but we would obviously have to keep an open mind on that until all the argument has been heard. But anyway, sorry, I'm interrupting.
Chair, I was just about to say I'm grateful to you because actually the last point that I was going to make on this issue was that my understanding of the evidence, including some of the oral evidence being given by senior officers who I think were involved in the decision, was that actually they weren't aware of the intelligence that criminal intelligence. So therefore, my other criticism in relation to intelligence is exactly as you articulated, that actually decision may have been made without regard to it.
Chair, just rounding out this, to provide the Commission with the reference to Lieutenant Colonel Scott's evidence with respect to that he put out the request for intelligence regarding atmosphere and attitude to the police, and nothing came back. The oral evidence reference for that Mr. White referred to, just to give you that, it's day 140, the 30th of October last year, line 18, page 15125 to line 15, 15127. Sorry, line 3, page 15127, just so that you have the reference to the oral evidence that he was referring to. Chair, I intend to move on to the next topic. I see we're 1 minute to 1.
Doesn't look as if you can deal within a minute.
No.
It's until 1:45.
Thank you, Chair.